Welcome to this video, which is a follow-up about the written task introduction for the IB 2020. So in this video, we're particularly going to tackle the key elements that you need to be doing in order to write a successful written paper. And last video, we saw that, first of all, you needed to be aware about the themes of the course that you're following, and that you must have an awareness of the type of texts that needed to come in within those tasks that could come up if you wish. We also saw that particularly for the writing exam, it was important for you to read the text or the task itself and analyze it in depth. Okay, just let me do that. That will make it easier. We also reviewed that there was a criteria based on language, and I give you some advice on how to do those and how you could tackle those more complex ideas. There was a message criteria, and also that there was a criteria for the format, which was linked to the type of text that we talked about. We also saw that it was absolutely crucial for you to, when you get your paper, to highlight the section that were of key importance, as I've done there. The yellow bits are the things about the things that must be doing or must be done within the task, and also perhaps the constraint in green that your public was, for instance, in this task that you've got on the screen there, it was basically students association and for teenagers talking about the COVID-19 crisis and learning tasks at home. So when you get your paper, it's important that you analyze this very carefully so you've got an idea of how you're going to be able to write towards structuring your answer in order to get a successful format, message, and language. So my advice before everything is that all too often students get the task and they start writing down straight off as they come in their heads. So they start writing, for example, a letter, and they start off saying, "Dear blah blah blah, I'm writing to you to say blah blah blah." Before you start writing, one thing that you must be doing before you do anything on paper is to make a plan. And here, I think it is important to think about two things. And one of the things that you need to think about in depth is, what is the difference between brainstorming and planning? If you're brainstorming, you're just listing the key points you're going to write, but it doesn't mean that uh, those points come any order. And I think that is a mistake that students do often. They write the key ideas, the things that they think are going to help them answer the task, but they don't put them in a particular order. So what I would suggest is perhaps follow the same approach. Is it about brainstorming or is it about planning? Well, actually, it's about both. I think it's always good to start by brainstorming, so writing the list of key points in any particular order, and then decide which point is going to come first. So maybe my point Z is going to go before my point X because it fits better the story or whatever I want to write. So that comes to the macro structure of your text, if you wish. We're going to talk about that a little bit later on. But it's also about planning. And what I would say, planning is about ordering those ideas, definitely. So if you want to do an efficient planning, you need to brainstorm first, and then you need to order those points. And that's what I call planning. Maybe some people will disagree. Let me know in the comments below if you disagree. What I would suggest that, for example, if you were, this was a mind mapping for my essay, one of the key arguments would be benefits, collaboration, productivity, creativity, and planning. And then my key ideas, oopsie, would be the bits that are in between, the flesh rather than the bones. Okay, so I think that's important that when you do the planning, then you think about all those things. I'm going to show you later on in the video 2 tasks that have been planned by some of my students. Thank you, students. You shall remain anonymous. And so let's talk about the microstructure. First of all, it's important once you've completed your planning and brainstorming that you know kind of what you're going to mention. First of all, I would like to remind everyone that I believe it's absolutely crucial to know how to structure your paragraphs. I'm not saying those things need to be in a certain order, although sometimes having a certain do it in a certain order helps you remember what is important and to include them all. But first of all, I think it's important that you mention your points. So in each paragraph, you could have a main point. What is your point? What is the key idea that you want the reader to understand? What is your main argument within this paragraph? Okay, is it, for example, in the task that we had about COVID-19, you're saying, well, one of the main argument is that distance learning is not a social thing. It is something that removes the social aspects of learning. Okay, that could be my main point. Then I would give you an example which illustrates my argument, or also known sometimes in talk as a real life situation. So you could say, for instance, yes, maybe sometimes remote learning would be beneficial. However, for an English class, um, there is a large amount of things in an English class that require uh, conversations with your classmates. So that would be my example, the thing that would show why I believe that sometimes it is appropriate, sometimes maybe it isn't. And maybe uh, after that, I could provide evidence and saying, for instance, within that example, I could say, when my lockdown was over, I thought it was really difficult to actually knowing whether I was ahead of the group or behind the group and so on. So that could be something that supports my point of view. I call it evidence because it gives you a nice acronym at the end. More on that later. Then also you have to think about justifying. Why do you think that this point is absolutely crucial and important to take into consideration? Okay, so if in that context that we have in our task that we had on the screen earlier, is a justification, you say, well, yes, maybe when if we do some flip learning in lessons, meaning that we can watch videos on YouTube about, I don't know, osmosis in physics or in biology or whatever, uh, then it's very useful to come to the practical with a very concrete idea of what are the key concepts. So therefore, yes, remote learning in that respect is very important. Okay. Then the link. Don't forget that in the next paragraph, you're going to talk about another thing. So is there a link between this paragraph and the next? Maybe if my main paragraph there was that, yes, remote learning is sometimes useful, then my link would be that, but sometimes it isn't useful. And then in the next paragraph, I would say, okay, it's not useful because, and I would give another point, another example, another evidence, another justification, and link it to the following paragraph. Okay, so that's what we call the microstructure. Now we're coming to talking to the macrostructure of your text. Okay, so that's outside of the paragraphs, the overall architecture of that. Again, this is not one stop shop or an answer that fits all. You can decide to do your own thing, but it tends to be pretty much useful to do this and think in those terms, in my views. If you disagree, let me know. First of all, I would say that you start with the introduction and then you move on to your first paragraph. You could start by your pros or cons, it doesn't matter. But then in your second paragraph, you could counter that idea with a con. And that is something as an IB student that you will have to do in your extended essay and in your talk essays and also talk presentations or um, exhibition. So you've got to be ready to know that what would be the pros or the interesting aspect and the things that people may not agree with. That shows your critical thinking aspects element if you're an IB student. Uh, okay, and then you could follow that up with paragraph 3, another pro or idea number 2. I forgot to write that down, and then a counter idea to number 2 as cons again. So if you wish, you've got paragraph 1 and 2 that are about ID 1, and paragraph 3 and 4 that are about ID 2. Okay, so if we think about the context of our task that we had earlier, you could say paragraph 1 Well, remote learning is very useful. Counter idea that sometimes it isn't useful. However, given the situation, paragraph 3, that people were dying and we had to protect life of people, maybe this is what we had to do. Paragraph 4, however, we saw in the task that it says, well, the school is going to take the permanent decision to teach some subject always online. And that's where perhaps, as a counter idea, you could say, well, even though the situation was extraordinary, as in paragraph 3, then you could say in paragraph 4, this is not suitable to replace learning in those subjects to cut costs, for instance. And then you could have, again, your point, evidence, and justification in that paragraph as well, which should then be finished by a conclusion. Watch out, the conclusion is often forgotten by students. And a good conclusion, in my view, sometimes 2 lines is definitely not long enough. I would suggest you've got at least 4 lines. And it's important that in the conclusion, you're not repeating your key arguments from paragraph 1, 2, 3, and 4, but that you are also telling us why those ideas are fitting together. So it's not about repeating, it's about reusing those arguments to make the person who reads you understand the key elements that make an answer to that task and give them an overall picture. And maybe you can bring in another topic in the conversation, maybe open it up in your conclusion. Of course, this type of text is not always suitable. If it's a blog, perhaps. If it's a letter, it might be. If it's a speech as well. But if there are other type of text, sometimes it's a bit difficult. So it's not a magic recipe. Your macrostructure cannot just go with pros and cons. Sometimes you could just say part 1, first half is pro and second is cons. It's entirely up to you. But this is what I think can work in some instances. If you've got a picture of your macrostructure and microstructure, then you've got a good, you're in a good position to actually think about your fulfilling the task that you've been asked. Final thing that I would recommend to young people that try to write a written paper is also always remember to think about those. Who writes to who? And why is this person writing? Remember, this person doesn't have to be you. You could imagine you're someone else. Isn't that great? Show your creativity there. What message do you want to pass? What is the thing that you're really asking? So, for example, we are going to review that in 2 planning sheets that some students have provided to me. More now. So always think about the context. So those are essentially my key advice. So let's have a look. Here is a plan. First of all, it's an extensive plan, and perhaps you will say that maybe you don't have time to plan all this. Often my students ask me, should I plan in French or should I plan in English? Well, I think here you can see you've got a mix. You've got some English and you've got some French. And yes, probably you in the real paper, you don't have 45 minutes to actually do all that. So maybe it will be a little bit shorter. But however, I still think this is a good plan. However, you've got, I can see the meta structure or the macro structure in there about the arguments within the paragraphs, and I can see that is each paragraph, and I kind of get an overall idea about what is the overall structure, the macro structure, and the microstructure as well within each aspect. Okay, I also know the type of text that are going to be used and who is writing to who, why they're writing, and what are the key points that they're going to try to pass on during the task. So let's have a look at another one, which I think is a good one as well. But here we only got the key points. We've got key points, the key ideas that we needed to include, certainly, but I don't really have an idea about the macro structure or how those points are going to be organized, in other words, so they are developed in a logical and way that is going to support the reader that is going to read. Okay, for you guys, your examiner, essentially. So what I would advise you to do there is to perhaps this, are they in the real order? Should it need to be reordered? Next phase would be perhaps to number those tasks and to say, okay, this is going to be paragraph 3, this is going to be paragraph 1, this is going to be paragraph 2, and so on. Okay, so that is something that is definitely possible to do. So going back to that, I would say that yes, make a detailed plan, but have perhaps it's in your head. So you don't need to write intro, however, and so on, and your key arguments. But I can tell you that the students that usually make good plans tend to write better tasks. Okay. If you go about in your life and thinking that actually spontaneity and stream of consciousness is going to take you somewhere with this, then it might be, but not for your IB paper. So remember, who writes to who, why are you writing this? So for example, in our essay, it could be the student body writing to the direction of the school and saying, look, we to the principal, for instance, and say, dear principal, we are writing to you because we want to change this. Okay. And that I know who writes to who. Why am I writing is because we strongly think that it's not cut delivering lessons online only for some subjects that don't require specialist equipment is a big mistake, for example, in English. Okay, because so much conversations happen and social things. Also, it is the issue of inequality in school. Um, and also, what is the key message you want to pass? So therefore, what are you asking them to do? Are you asking them to repeal that decision, or do you ask them to change their minds slightly, or you could completely condemn? And sometimes you can also propose solutions, what you think should be done instead. So those are all things that can be done to actually write and answer a good written task. But don't forget, sometimes they will be looking very different depending on which type of text that you have chosen to write. Okay, so if that was useful, then let me know. This was a follow-up from previous video. You can find in the links below. And do let me know if you got any questions below and if you liked those. Um, if you find this useful and you think it could be useful to other people, like and subscribe and share with uh, the people that you know that could find this interesting. Thank you very much.